Hi, everyone. We're really excited to have Greg Lyle back with us today to answer some questions from our June 10th webinar. We just wanted to get some answers to those folks who asked, and also have this available to everyone, and we'll have it up on our YouTube channel as well shortly. So we'll get right to the questions. The first question we had was from Brian Klender, and the question is, how soft if the level of overall satisfaction in federal and provincial governments? Example, will it hold or revert back to where we were before the crisis?
Right. So it's not very soft. The overall rally that's been going on in terms of COVID came on strong in March and has been stable for the past 3 months, all the way through April, May, and June, with no immediate signs of fading. The other thing that's important is that it's translated into some important political changes. And the heart of that is essentially that all the leaders of government in Canada have seen an improvement in their underlying favorables. Some of them have seen dramatic improvements. And even as the rally fades, and it no doubt will, everything that goes up comes down in time, that personal brand growth that the various premiers have experienced is going to, and the prime minister, that potentially will last longer than government approval. What's interesting is that it's been 10 days since our presentation, something like that, and we've done another poll in the meantime. And in that latest poll, we have seen for the first time in 4 months just as many people that say that they're less impressed with the federal government as more impressed as a result of what they've heard. So that is the first sign that the government may have feet of clay, and that in fact we're going to see a reemergence of politics as normal. And for what it's worth, just because I'm sure someone would ask if they were there, the number one thing that drove unfavorables was losing a bit for the UN Security Council, but also the two Michaels in prison in China has been an important negative issue for the government. And then finally, even though it's an issue for the average person in Canada, there are a number of people that are concerned about government spending. And if you mention government spending as the thing that you've heard about government spending deficits, the rating being reduced, those people are very negative in terms of how they feel towards the government. So some signs of politics coming back to normal, but only the beginning of it. Right. So at the moment, the overall approvals are still very strong. The Prime Minister's favorables are back up to where they've been prior to the India trip.
Right. And that's a good segue, Greg, to this next question from David in Toronto. And David asks, Greg, has the public's patience for the lockdown been reached? And if there is a second wave of COVID-19 this fall, are we tapped out in terms of more stay-at-home medicine? Thanks.
And the short answer to that is no, we're not tapped out. The longer answer is that the public expects at least one, if not more, waves. The most common answer when we say, "Is this it? Have we solved this problem? Will there be one more wave, or will there be more?" The most common answer is more than one wave. So people think there's going to be more. When we ask them, is government going too fast or too slow in terms of reopening? Most people say the governments have it right, but more people are likely to say they're too fast than too slow. And finally, we asked people about 12 different priorities for government to focus on. 6 of them were healthcare related, and 6 of them were things like jobs and controlling the deficit and other types of priorities. All 6 of the health priorities were more important than any one of the other priorities. And so there's still a big desire to see government stay focused on keeping us safe. That is the number one thing. Related to that, though, we did ask people, what do you think is the best approach if there's another wave? Because we had different approaches in this country. So, for instance, in BC, the government or the health officer took the approach of saying, everything can stay open if they operate safely, except for these specific organizations which I have ordered shut. So, for instance, hair salons and eventually restaurants. But in other places in the country, the governments took the other approach. Everyone will stay shut down unless you were on this list of essential services, which was pretty big in most places. anyhow, the public's general approach on going forward would be take the BC approach. Let things stay open unless there's a clear reason to shut them down, but insist that they do it in a safe and protected way. So I think that there's a desire to see people learn from the first wave, but the priority is still to make the top priority the public safety.
No, that's really interesting. Thanks for that. And from Dave, we got the question that you had mentioned during your presentation that electricity utilities have done fairly well reputationally. And is this consistent across the country? And do government-owned monopolies often do better or worse than others?
So the way we did that section, we had 26 different sectors we did, so we randomized it. So we only have about half the sample for electrical utilities, and it's hard to draw huge nuances. The basic story is that it's pretty stable across the country. The one place that seems to be doing a little better than others in terms of utilities is actually Ontario. So, and what's interesting about that is that most utilities in Ontario are still publicly owned. Even Hydro One still has a big public ownership. But they're not the vertically integrated crowns that you see in Quebec or Manitoba, et cetera, across the country. And there's no indication that privately owned utilities are any different when we cut it. And again, what is private, right? So do you call EPCOR private? Is a big question. Anyhow, the long story to that is it looks like it's generally the case across Canada. And utilities have actually done not just reasonably well, but quite well. I think they rank about 5th of all the sectors that we looked at. And there's that sense among utilities that, they go out when the rest of us go home, right? The wind comes up, wires go down, out come the utility people making sure that we have the services we need. And since we're stuck in our homes, that becomes even more important in the eyes of the public. So, so they've done well. And I think the other thing that utilities avoided that others did not avoid was issues over billing. So if you look at, there's two groups of sectors that had problems because of COVID. One are the sectors associated with the spread of the disease, and those sectors are in quite a bit of trouble, as you would expect. The other group that didn't actually lose reputation, overall, but had some losses as well, some gains, were the ones where the issues were financial. And that could have happened to utilities, and it might happen to utilities in the future. So I'd say that they shouldn't take this for granted, and that as they think about the fall, they should be thinking about what approach are they going to take to delinquent bills.
That's very well put, Greg. And I think this builds on to the next question that Paul Costa sent in. And Paul asked, can you expand on the critical threat to the Ford government on long-term care? And specifically, how would he be able to maintain his current standing if the reviews are bad?
Right. So all across Canada, long-term care is the weak link for governments, including the federal government. But it's particularly an issue in Ontario where the government's actually in negative territory in terms of its performance. So the issue that Ford has got to deal with going forward is what does he do in the next weeks and months to make sure that when the next wave hits, that patients in seniors' homes will be protected. That is going to be the question. People will look in context. So, I mean, I think one of the things that we see, whether you're in Ontario, BC, or wherever, is that most of the deaths have occurred among people that are in care facilities. Some places have had fewer deaths in facilities than others, but pretty much everywhere has had more deaths in facilities than in the other places. So people understand that this is a general problem. But that being said, knowing that it's a general problem does not give governments a free pass on this. And so that it'll really come down to what action does Ford take over the summer to deal with the fundamental weaknesses, some progress really isn't going to be acceptable. They're going to have to find a way to stop the spread of this disease. And it's not a new thing, right? This happens every year with flu. And so if we make changes now in response to COVID, it actually can have big benefits in stopping the spread of flu and other respiratory diseases like that have been creating early deaths, unnecessary deaths, for a long time.
Perfect. No, that's great. And it's interesting just seeing how it's going to impact public polling for different politicians across the country. But I think we've seen it so evident in Ontario, and It's been very interesting to watch. So the next question we have is from Che Wei, and he asks, from your polling, in your opinion, do you think Canadians will accept stricter self-isolating rules that countries and contact tracing, like the governments of Taiwan, New Zealand, South Korea, Singapore, et cetera, have imposed on their citizens? These countries have obviously essentially been forcing returning citizens to stay home or in a hotel.
Right. So the first thing I would just note is that all the evidence we have seen is that this is actually a real problem. So we were tracking, we didn't have a huge sample that you would really need to capture this. But every wave we did in the early stages, we were asking people, have they returned to the country, and doing a crosstab of people who have returned from the country to the country with what social activities have been. And we were pretty surprised that in every single way, people who said that they had returned to the country were reporting a lot of social interaction. In some cases, even more than people that had not been traveling. So there's a sense that for a lot of people, when they got home, they went out and shopped, even though they were told not to. They were told to get deliveries. They went and visited friends or family because they'd just come home for whatever reason. And this is not what they were supposed to do. So it's pretty clear that if the stated goal of causing returning travelers to self-isolate, that just didn't happen. They did not do that. And the result was community spread. So we're going to have to get tougher, and that's where the public wants to go. Their number one priority after long-term care is dealing with returning travelers in a future pandemic. We did, you might recall, we did take some people that returned from a cruise ship and put them into a military camp. So it's not like we didn't do that for anybody. And if you look at some of the provinces, I know, for instance, in BC, if you couldn't prove you had a plan, the BC government put you up in hotels. So I think that's the expectation, that the government will take steps to enforce this. I've heard a number of stories about how government enforcement changed. That by, within the last few weeks, people have been telling me about, a daughter would come home from the United States, and their plan would be to quarantine in the basement of their parents' place or something, and there'd be 6 calls in 14 days, and 3 of the calls were in-person visits. So that's what the public's looking for, and governments have already sort of moved that. But there was a problem. This was needed.
Yeah, no, for sure, Greg. And another big issue that has come up, over the last couple months has been racism and anti-racism issues. And so we have a couple questions from a couple members that I thought we would combine together that I think you'll be interested in answering. So Teresa Sarkeesian asked, have you done any polling on the anti-racism issue? And then Mark Sakai asked, are we moving on to racism as the next big issue? Your thoughts?
Yeah. So as it happens, next week we'll be beginning to come out, and the week following continue to come out with some work we've done with some partner organizations on the experience of discrimination in Canada and whether or not COVID's had any disproportionate impacts on particularly vulnerable groups of Canadians. And in doing that work, we are also building on some work we've done in the past, ironically, just before blackface hit in the federal election, on dealing with discrimination. And we had actually looked at this back in, I think, 2008 or 2009, and I can't remember what the issue was at the time, but we had some tracking from there. So number one, is this the next big issue? This has been the year of big issues, right? So we started off with the wildfires down in Australia, with the tremendous damage that's happening there, and that was going to create a moment in terms of talking about climate change. And then we went from that to having the big moment for Indigenous issues related to the Coastal GasLink blockades and protests. And so that was going to be the big issue. We were going to deal with Indigenous issues. And then COVID hit, and COVID brought with it debate over healthcare, over public finance, over the economy and equity in this country. And now we have the racism thing. And so what I would say is that this is the first time I can recall that racism became a true front burner, overarching, shove every other issue aside type debate in this country. And we're seeing an impact. We see, we've tracked how people feel about different minority groups in this country. And what we're seeing is that people are giving much more positive ratings to minority groups that they were more, I don't know if I want to use the word hostile, but gave lower ratings to in the past. And a really good example of that was Muslims, right? So Muslims have been hit hard by backlash related to terrorism. And there was a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment in this country. Feelings towards Muslims have improved dramatically. We're just finalizing the numbers now, but I think the number that had a negative view of Muslims has literally dropped in half from tracking that we did just a couple of years ago. So that is definitely getting better. The other thing that has significantly changed is the number of people that say we have a problem with racism today. So many Canadians were willing to recognize that there had been problems in the past, but there were fewer Canadians willing to accept that we had problems today with racism and discrimination more broadly. The number that see Canada as having an ongoing problem with discrimination has grown over the past few months. So I think this particular protest is actually having the effect that they intend, which is to raise the issue as a concern and to change people's views. And we're seeing both less indication of racist and discriminatory actions, but more concern about the problem. And I don't think it's an accident those go together, because as we become better as a society in how we treat each other, or at least how we see each other, it is quite possible that that is linked to the sense of this is an issue where we have to do better. So it's interesting. It's clearly making a difference. But all that being said, this has been the year of issues coming and going. And it's only a matter of time before we start talking about something else. So the question that I have, and that I don't have an answer to today, is not has racism and discrimination become a big thing, because it has. The question is this a one-off, one moment in time event, or does racism and discrimination become part of the issue cycle? That it's always around, ready to take center stage, and that's important, because to the degree that there is a threat that this issue will come back to the forefront, it creates pressure on the political side of government to stay on top of the issue. If this is a one-off thing, that it's in reaction to events outside the country, and when those events move on, the country moves on, or something bigger comes along. So if we get the second wave of COVID next week, if we see the type of spiraling of COVID cases that we're seeing in the United States for whatever reason, that would crowd the issue of racism and discrimination off the stage. But so I'm always skeptical about how long these things, how much shelf life they have, but I'm encouraged by these underlying changes that are quite significant and quite dramatic. and not the normal course of events for these sort of fundamental pre-existing predispositions that have built up over time.
Yeah, I know for sure, Greg. It's a loaded issue, right? And I think it speaks to the wide uncertainty that's happening right now in our society, and I think really puts perspective in terms of what public affairs professionals may be thinking in terms of all the issues that we talked about today. There's a lot of uncertainty, and I think we can't predict what's going to happen from one day to the next, right? So we're definitely still in unique territory for sure. But listen, Greg, we on behalf of Talisha, myself, and the entire Public Affairs Association of Canada, we really appreciate you taking the time to do this bonus YouTube recording of some of the outstanding questions that we had from the webinar that you were at. You've always been a fantastic ambassador for PAC, as well as been always gracious with your time. So we thank you for everything. I think our members, along with other public affairs professionals, will appreciate this bonus recording. So thank you very much for that. And before we sign off, everyone, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you haven't checked us out online, there's a few ways you can check us out by visiting our website at www.publicaffairs.ca, as well as to follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, as well as on Twitter at PAC84, where you can join the conversation to find out about all our events and all our initiatives and activities within the association. As well as a friendly reminder about membership to the association. There are a lot of great benefits in terms of being part of our member committees, being able to participate in advocacy activities on lobbying legislation, being able to attend members-only events, among many other perks of being a member of the Public Affairs Association of Canada. So to learn more about membership, visit our website at publicaffairs.ca to learn more. And stay tuned, because there's a few webinars we're organizing over the next while, including next week, next Tuesday, specifically on crisis communications. We have a fantastic panel lined up, and all the details to register can be found on our website. So thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon. Take care.